He slammed every dollar he owned onto that saloon counter without a word. 12 weeks of trapping alone in the mountains. 12 weeks of frostbite and near starvation. And he paid a debt that belonged to a woman he had never once spoken to in his life. The room went dead silent. Clara Whitmore stood there shaking, unable to even look at the man who had just saved her from being dragged out into the street like livestock. Elias Carter picked up his hat, turned his back on the whole room, and walked out alone. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The winter of 1881 came down on the Wyoming territory like something personal. It wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that had intentions, the kind that crept under a man's coat and sat against his ribs and reminded him, quietly and without mercy, that the land out here didn't care whether he lived or died. The kind of cold that killed cattle, killed crops, killed men who got careless, and some men who didn't. Elias Carter had survived 11 of these winters alone. I wasn't a large man, not in the way that made people step back when he walked into a room. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something settled and unhurried and entirely without apology, that made people move out of his path anyway. He was 34 years old and looked closer to 40. His hands were scarred from trapping wire and frozen rope. His face had been burned brown by wind and sun until it looked like old leather. He had dark eyes that didn't blink much, and when they landed on you, you felt like you'd been assessed and filed away in under 3 seconds. He rode into Raven Creek that Tuesday evening with 2 pack mules loaded with pelts and one goal: trade the furs, buy his winter supplies, and get back up the mountain before the storm that was building to the northwest made the trail impassable. He'd done it 100 times. He knew exactly how long it took, exactly what he needed, exactly how much human interaction was required to complete the transaction and get back to silence. He had no interest in Raven Creek's problems. He never did. Raven Creek was the kind of frontier town that had come together fast and was falling apart just as quickly. A cluster of timber buildings along a rutted main street, a general store, a livery, a handful of homesteads spread out along the creek bottom, and one saloon that served as courthouse, meeting hall, and gambling den depending on what the week required. The people who lived there were the kind of people who had nowhere better to go, which didn't make them bad people, but it didn't always make them good ones either. Elias tied his mules outside the trading post, conducted his business in 12 minutes flat, and was loading his supplies when he heard the shouting from across the street. He didn't turn around immediately. Shouting in a saloon wasn't unusual. It wasn't his business. He cinched a rope over a crate of salt and kept working. But then he heard a woman's voice. Not shouting, not angry. Something worse than both of those things. Pleading. He paused with his hands still on the rope. The voice was coming from the saloon. It was low and careful, like someone trying not to cry in public and losing the battle inch by inch. He couldn't make out the words yet, just the tone, and the tone was the sound of someone being slowly dismantled in front of witnesses. Elias stood there for a moment longer than he should have. Then he dropped the rope and crossed the street. The saloon was warmer than the outside air, which wasn't saying much, and it smelled like wood smoke and spilled whiskey, and the particular sourness of too many unwashed bodies in an enclosed space. About 15 men were gathered in a loose half-circle near the far end of the bar. Some of them were leaning against the counter. Some had their arms crossed. All of them had the look of men watching something they had already decided wasn't their problem. In the middle of that half-circle stood a woman. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair that had come partially loose from its pins and a gray wool coat that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric. She was holding a small leather purse with both hands, pressed against her stomach like a shield, and she was looking up at the man across from her with the expression of someone who had already tried everything and was running out of options. The man she was facing was Gerald Holt. Elias knew Holt by reputation. Merchant, moneylender, and the kind of man who understood that the frontier gave certain people enormous power over others and had decided, at some point in his life, to be one of those people. He was thick through the chest, expensively dressed for Raven Creek standards, with small pale eyes and the easy confidence of a man who almost never heard the word no. "Mrs. Whitmore," Holt was saying, and his voice had that particular smoothness that Elias associated with men who had learned to be pleasant about cruelty. "I've been more than patient. Your husband's debt has been outstanding for 7 months." "I know," the woman said. "I know, and I'm asking for—" "You've been asking," Holt interrupted gently, "for 4 months now, asking and promising. And here we are." "I have $15, she said. Her voice didn't break, but it came close. "I know it isn't enough. But if you'd allow me to make payments, I can sew, I can clean, I can take in laundry. Mr. Holt, I will work every single day until the debt is settled. I swear it. I just need—" $120, Holt said. "That's what your husband owed me when he died. 7 months of interest on top of that. Mrs. Whitmore, I am a businessman. I cannot run a business on promises. Then take the $15 as good faith and give me time. I've given you time." The pleasantness slipped, just slightly, just enough. "What I'm going to do now is recover my assets, your husband's wagon, your horse, the tools in your barn." He paused. "And if those don't cover it, we'll discuss what else you have to offer." The room was very quiet. Several of the men shifted their weight. One looked at the floor. Nobody said anything. The woman, Clara Whitmore, Elias supposed, went still in a way that was different from composure. It was the stillness of someone who had just understood something terrible and hadn't yet figured out what to do with the understanding. "You can't take the horse," she said quietly. "Without the horse, I can't get to town. Without the wagon, I can't haul water in winter. You'd be leaving me with nothing. I'd be recovering what I'm owed. You'd be leaving me to die." Her voice was flat now, the pleading gone out of it, replaced by something that was either resignation or the outermost edge of rage. "You know that. A woman alone out there without transportation in a Wyoming winter. You know exactly what that means." Holt smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You should have thought about that before your husband made his business decisions, ma'am." And that was the moment Elias moved. I wasn't entirely sure, afterward, that he had made a conscious decision. It was more like something in his body made the decision before his mind caught up. His legs carrying him through the ring of watchers, his hand going into his coat pocket where he kept his earnings from the season, his feet stopping at the edge of the space between Clara Whitmore and Gerald Holt. He pulled out a folded roll of bills. He had earned $140 that trapping season. 12 weeks alone in the high country, working lines in temperatures that had dropped to 30 below, hauling deadfall through snow that came to his thighs. $140 represented everything he had. It was supposed to buy his winter supplies and a new rifle part and enough salt to cure meat through February. He counted out $120 without looking up. He set it on the bar in front of Holt. "There's your 120, he said. "Debt's paid." The room was absolutely silent. Holt stared at the money. Then he looked up at Elias with those pale eyes, measuring, recalculating. "And who exactly are you?" he asked. "Nobody," Elias said. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me. This woman is a stranger to you." "The debt is paid," Elias said again. "We're done here." Holt was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was deciding how much of a scene he wanted to make, and whether the scene would cost him more than the money. Finally, he picked up the bills and counted them with slow deliberateness, like a man demonstrating that he was not rushed, that he was in control, that this outcome had somehow been his preference all along. "We're done," he said at last. Then to Clara, "For now." Elias didn't acknowledge the addendum. He turned away from Holt and looked at Clara Whitmore for the first time directly. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. There was something more complicated behind her eyes, something that looked like it had been a long time since anyone had done anything unexpected for her, and she wasn't sure yet what it meant or what it would cost. "You don't need to do anything," Elias said. He meant it simply, as information, not reassurance. It settled. She opened her mouth. He turned and walked out of the saloon before she could say whatever she was going to say. He finished loading his mules in the cold, mounted up, and rode north toward the mountain trail. The storm was closer now. He could see it building along the ridgeline, gray-purple and heavy with snow. He needed to make the first pass before dark. He didn't think about Clara Whitmore again. Or rather, he tried not to. He was most of the way up the mountain trail, the temperature dropping fast and the first flakes beginning to fall, when he admitted to himself that the $120 he'd handed over to Gerald Holt was going to change his winter significantly. No new rifle part meant the old one stayed cracked and unreliable. The salt supply would be short. He'd have to be more careful with his provisions than he'd planned. He told himself it was fine. He'd survived on less. He reached his cabin just as full dark fell and the snow began in earnest, unsaddled his horse, stabled her with extra feed, unloaded the mules, stowed his supplies, and built up the fire. The cabin was as he'd left it, cold, sparse, clean in the way that things get clean when nobody lives in them with any softness. A single bunk, a rough table, a wood stove, shelves of supplies along one wall, a row of tools along another. He ate a cold supper because he was too tired to cook, and he sat by the stove in the silence and listened to the wind come up outside. By the time he went to sleep, the storm was howling. When he woke, it had passed. He lay in his bunk for a moment in the gray morning light, cataloging the sounds of the mountain, the creak of the cabin settling in the cold, the distant call of something in the timber, the silence that was never really silence if you knew how to listen to it. He'd lived 11 winters here. He knew every sound this place made, which was why the sound he heard next stopped him cold. Footsteps. Outside the cabin door. Slow and deliberate through the snow, getting closer. I was out of the bunk and across the floor in 3 seconds, his rifle off the wall and at his shoulder before the knock came. 2 careful knocks, not frantic, not loud. He stood to one side of the door. "Who's there?" A pause. "Clara Whitmore." Her voice was steady. "I'm not armed. I'm cold. I'd appreciate if you'd open the door, but I understand if you don't." Elias stood very still for a moment. Then he unlatched the door and swung it open. She was standing on his porch in the same coat she'd worn the night before, her boots and skirt hem caked with snow to the knee. She'd walked up the mountain trail in the dark and through the storm, 6 miles of switchback climbing in the worst weather of the season. And she was standing there looking at him with steady dark eyes and a canvas bag over one shoulder. And she looked cold down to her bones, but she didn't look defeated. She looked determined. "You walked up here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did. In the storm. Most of it had passed by the time I started. The last mile was rough." He stared at her for a moment, caught genuinely off balance in a way that almost never happened to him. "What do you want?" he asked. "To work," she said. He blinked. "The debt is paid, Mrs. Whitmore. I told you. I know what you told me." She didn't move from the porch. "And I heard you. I'm not here because I think I owe you money. I'm here because I think I owe myself something, and I'd like to propose an arrangement. I don't need—" "You paid $120, she said. "That's a significant sum. I don't know what it cost you, and I won't pretend I can imagine it. But you did it for a stranger, without being asked, without wanting anything in return." She paused. "That kind of thing requires an answer. My answer is this. I will work for my keep until I have contributed something equal to what you gave. Not because you're requiring it, because I am." The wind moved between them. Snow shifted off the porch roof. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "You don't know what mountain work is," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "but I know how to learn. It's dangerous country, especially for someone who doesn't know it." "I expect it is." "You'd be alone up here with a man you don't know." Something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, but acknowledgement. "I have been alone in a town full of people who watched Gerald Holt try to ruin me and said nothing. I'll take my chances with the man who actually did something." That silenced him. He looked at her bag. He looked at her boots, soaked through. He thought about the cracked rifle part and the short salt supply and the long months of winter remaining. And then he thought about the sound of her voice in that saloon. Not the pleading part, but the part at the end, when she'd gone flat and said you'd be leaving me to die, and meant it as a plain statement of fact. He stepped back from the door. "There's coffee on the stove," he said. "Take off your boots before they freeze to your feet. And Mrs. Whitmore—" He waited until she looked at him. "We set terms, clear ones. You stay on your side of those terms, I'll stay on mine. You decide at any point you want to go back down, I'll ride you down myself. There's no obligation here that goes past what you can handle." She stepped inside. "Mr. Carter," she said, setting her bag down and moving toward the stove with her hands out toward the warmth. "I intend to handle quite a lot." He wasn't sure later whether he believed her in that moment. He knew mountain work. He knew what it asked of a person. The physical demands, the isolation. The way the mountain had a way of finding every crack in a person's character and widening it until something either broke or held. He had seen grown men break in the first week, but she had walked 6 miles up a mountain in the dark after surviving the previous night in a saloon, and she had knocked on his door with steady hands and proposed an arrangement rather than asked for mercy. So he let her in. And the arrangement began. The first 3 days were harder than he'd told her they would be, and he'd been fairly direct about the difficulty. The work of keeping a mountain cabin functional through winter wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't simple. Wood had to be cut and hauled and stacked. Water had to be carried from the creek before it froze over in the mornings, or broken through ice when it did. Food had to be managed carefully. What was preserved and what was still fresh. What could be cooked quickly and what required time. What would last through deep winter and what needed to be used before it turned. The animals needed tending. The traps needed checking and resetting, which meant time on the mountain in the cold, regardless of conditions. Clara didn't complain. What she did instead was watch. He noticed it on the second day, the way she paid attention to everything he did, how he did it, why. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. When she didn't understand something, she asked once and remembered the answer. When she made a mistake, and she made several, especially in the first days, she didn't make excuses, and she didn't make the same mistake twice. On the third morning, he came back from checking the lower trap line to find her inside with his hunting coat laid out across the table. "What are you doing?" he asked, stopping in the doorway. "Repairing it," she said, without looking up. She had a needle and thread, and was working on the torn left sleeve with small, very precise stitches. The seam was pulling apart at the shoulder. Another week and the sleeve would have come loose in the field. She glanced up briefly. "I hope that's all right. I should have asked first." He looked at the coat. The stitching she'd already done was tight and even, better than anything he could have managed with his own hands. "It's fine," he said. "There's a spot on the back too, near the collar. Looks like it caught on something sharp." She turned it over to show him. "I can reinforce it. Won't take long." "All right." He hung his outer coat and went to wash up, and when he came back she was still working, her head bent over the coat with complete concentration, her hands moving in that careful, unhurried way he was starting to recognize as entirely characteristic of her. He sat down across the table. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" he asked. She glanced up, slightly surprised, as if she hadn't expected conversation. "My mother," she said. "She could sew anything. She used to say that a woman who could sew well would never be entirely without options." A pause. "I didn't fully understand what she meant when I was young. You understand it now." "I do." She turned the coat over again and found the spot near the collar. "My husband couldn't sew a stitch. Couldn't cook either. He was good at other things. He was a careful man, and kind, mostly. But practical skills weren't among his gifts." Another pause, shorter. "He made some poor business decisions in the last year. I didn't know about most of them until after he was gone." Elias was quiet for a moment. "How long ago?" 14 months. She said it cleanly, without performance. "He got sick in early autumn of last year. It was fast. By December I was alone, and I didn't know about the debt until January, when Holt came to collect. And you've been in Raven Creek since." "I had nowhere else to go." She pulled the thread through and knotted it. "My family is in Ohio. I have a sister there. But I couldn't afford the fare, and I couldn't leave until I'd found some way to handle what Thomas owed. I thought—" She stopped and started again. I thought if I stayed and worked and showed good faith, Holt would give me time. I see now that was naive. Holt doesn't want money, Elias said. She looked up at him. No, she agreed. He doesn't. He wants leverage. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment, and in it he saw something old and tired. Not beaten, but weary in the way of someone who had been careful and watchful for a very long time. That's why I'm here, Mr. Carter. Not just because of the debt. Because down in that town there is a man who believes he owns a piece of my future, and as long as I am down there where he can reach me, he does. She looked back at the coat. Up here at least, I can breathe. He didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure one was required. She finished the repair and handed the coat back to him. He examined the stitching at the shoulder, straight and secure, the kind of work that would hold through a hard season. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. They ate supper that evening mostly in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than the cabin had held before she arrived. Less empty. He noticed it without wanting to notice it, the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, subtly, and he wasn't sure yet whether that was a warning or simply a fact. After supper, she organized his supply shelves while he sharpened his knife. Mr. Carter, she said, not turning around. You have 2 pounds of dried beans that have started to go off. He looked up. What? On the back of the second shelf, behind the flour. She lifted the bag to show him, turning it so he could see the faint mold starting along the bottom seam. If they aren't used soon, they'll contaminate what's around them. Did you smell something off when you opened the flour last? He thought about it. Maybe. We should use these beans first and check the flour. She set the bag on the table with gentle practicality. I'll make them for tomorrow's supper if that's all right. I know a way to cook them that stretches them well. That's fine. She turned back to the shelves. He watched her work for a moment. The organized efficiency of it. Nothing wasted, nothing overlooked. And he thought about how the cabin had looked before she arrived. Functional, sparse, maintained to the minimum standard required for survival, and not a degree beyond. He hadn't noticed the beans. He might have opened the flour in another week and found the problem only after it had spread. These were small things. But in a mountain winter, small things had a way of becoming large ones. I went back to his knife. By the end of the first week, he had stopped expecting her to quit. Not because the work had gotten easier, it hadn't, but because he had watched her closely enough by then to understand something about her that the saloon scene hadn't fully revealed. Clara Whitmore had a quality he had only seen in a handful of people in his life, and it was this. She was someone who dealt with reality as it actually was, rather than as she wished it were. She didn't dramatize the difficulty. She didn't minimize it either. She simply looked at what was in front of her, calculated what it required, and did it. On the 8th day, she asked to come with him on the trap line. He looked at her. It's a 4-hour walk, he said. Rough terrain, cold. I'm aware of what the outside looks like, she said, with a trace of something that might have been dry humor. I'd like to understand the whole of what you do. If I'm to be useful here, I should understand the operation. He studied her for a moment. Wear your heaviest layer, he said, and an extra pair of socks. She was at the door with her coat on before he'd finished the sentence. The trap line took them north along the ridge above the cabin, then down through a section of thick timber where he'd set a series of snares and steel jaw traps along the game trails. It was slow going in the snow. She didn't know how to read the terrain yet, where to step and where not to, how to move through heavy timber without announcing herself to everything within 100 yards. But she paid attention. He showed her how to approach a trap from downwind, how to check whether it had been sprung and why, how to reset it without losing fingers. She watched everything he did with that same careful, concentrated attention she brought to everything, and when he explained something she didn't nod vaguely. She asked specific follow-up questions that told him she'd actually understood the first part. Halfway through the line, they found a marten in one of the snares, still alive, thrashing. He reached for it automatically. Wait, she said. He stopped and looked at her. She was watching the animal with an expression he couldn't read. Is it in pain? She asked. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. She looked away. Go ahead. He dispatched the marten quickly. She didn't flinch, and she didn't look away. She watched what he did with the same focused attention she'd given everything else. When it was done, he reset the snare. He was aware of her standing a step behind him in the cold, breathing slowly. First time seeing that? He asked. No, she said. My husband hunted. I've seen animals taken before. A pause. I just wanted to know if it was suffering. It matters to me whether things are suffering, even when it can't be helped. He stood up and looked at her. That's a reasonable thing to care about, he said. She met his eyes briefly. You don't think it's foolish? Up here, practically speaking? No, he said. Caring whether something suffers is different from being unable to act when it does. Those aren't the same quality. Something in her expression shifted, slightly, as if he'd said something she hadn't expected from him. They finished the line and walked back to the cabin in the afternoon light, and if the silence between them was different from the silence on the way out, warmer, somehow, and with something unspoken moving through it that neither of them was ready to name. Neither of them mentioned it. That night, after supper, she took out a small leather-bound book from her bag. He watched her open it and begin writing in it. What's that? He asked. She glanced up. A ledger. She said it simply. I keep track of transactions. What's come in, what's gone out. It's a habit from managing the household accounts. She paused. I've been keeping notes on the supplies here. What we're using, at what rate, what we'll likely need before spring. If you'd like to see the calculations, I'm happy to share them. He blinked. You've been tracking the supplies? Since I organized the shelves on day 3. She turned the ledger to show him. Columns of careful figures, dates, quantities, projections. At our current rate, the salt will run short in late February. The smoked meat will hold until March if we're moderate. The flour is fine once we use the beans first. I'd suggest we prioritize the dried vegetables next. They're the most vulnerable to moisture damage with the thaw coming eventually. Elias looked at the ledger, then he looked at her. He had spent 11 winters on this mountain, managing his supplies by feel and experience. He had never once written down a projection or calculated a rate of consumption. He hadn't needed to, with only himself to account for. But looking at her figures, he could see immediately that the salt calculation was right. He'd been unconsciously aware of the shortfall and hadn't confronted it directly. And the dried vegetables. He knew the thaw brought moisture problems. He'd lost supplies to it before. Where'd you learn accounting? He asked. My father was a merchant. She closed the ledger and set it on the table between them. A small one, in Ohio. I helped him keep his books from the time I was 12. When I married Thomas and came west, I managed everything we had. A trace of something, not quite bitterness, more like rue, moved across her face. Which is how I know that if I'd been aware of the loans he was taking with Holt, I'd have stopped it. The numbers would have told me immediately what he apparently couldn't see. He kept it from you. He thought he was protecting me from worry. She said it without particular feeling, as if she'd already done all the feeling about it that was available. He was wrong. Ignorance isn't protection. It just means the disaster arrives without warning. Elias was quiet for a moment. Can I look at the full ledger? He asked. She slid it across the table to him. He spent an hour going through her figures that evening, the fire burning low and the wind moving outside, and Clara sat across from him, mending a pair of his wool socks with the same careful attention she brought to everything. And somewhere in the middle of that hour, something changed in the cabin that Elias Carter, who had spent 11 years building his life around the premise that he needed nothing and no one, would have been hard-pressed to name. It was something small and ordinary. It was two people sitting by a fire at the end of a hard day, each doing something useful, in silence that had stopped being empty. He wasn't sure when that had happened. He wasn't sure what it meant. But when he went to sleep that night, for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, the cabin didn't feel like a place a man went to survive. It felt in some quiet way that he wasn't ready to examine too closely, like somewhere he'd come home to. He hadn't expected her to last the first week. He hadn't expected her to last the second one either. But somewhere in the middle of the third week, Elias Carter stopped counting the days and started simply accepting that Clara Whitmore was here, that she worked harder than most men he'd known, and that the cabin had become a fundamentally different place because of it. And he couldn't decide, when he was honest with himself, whether that difference frightened him or not. It frightened him. He just didn't want to look at it directly. The morning that changed things started like any other. He was up before dawn, as always, moving quietly in the dark to build the fire up from coals, when he heard her already stirring on her side of the cabin's divided space. The curtain she'd hung on the third day, using one of his spare ropes and an old blanket, creating a partition that was more symbol than substance, but that they had both honored without discussion. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep." Her voice came through the curtain, calm and awake, not groggy. "I was thinking about the South Trap Line." He paused with a piece of kindling in his hand. "What about it?" "The last 3 times you've checked it, it's been empty. But you said there's been sign along the creek bottom below it." A pause. "I think something changed in how the game is moving through that section. The trail might be shifting." He stood up slowly. He had been thinking the same thing for 4 days and hadn't said it aloud. "I was going to move 2 of the sets tomorrow," he said. "I know where I'd move them." She pulled the curtain aside and stepped into the main room, already dressed, her dark hair braided back. She walked to the rough map he'd sketched on a piece of board that hung on the wall, a crude but accurate rendering of the terrain above and around the cabin, and pointed to a spot below the ridge. "Here," she said. "The creek bends east. Game coming down from the high country would follow the south bank to stay in the timber. If the main trail is shifting, it's shifting this direction." He came and stood beside her and looked at where she was pointing. She was right. He had known she was going to be right before he got there, which was somehow the more unsettling part. "How do you know the terrain that well?" he asked. "You've only been on the South Line twice." "I pay attention," she said, without any particular pride in it, just a statement of method. "And I asked you questions about the topography last week. You answered them. I remember what you said." He looked at the map for another moment. "All right," he said. "We'll move the sets today." She was already reaching for her coat. They worked side by side on the trap line that morning, moving through the timber in the cold gray light before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She was better in the terrain now than she'd been in the first week. She'd learned how to move, where to plant her feet, when to be still, and when to keep going. She wasn't fast yet, but she was quiet, which on the mountain mattered more. When they relocated the second set, she asked to do it herself. He stood back and watched her work through the process. The placement, the angle, the trigger sensitivity. And she did it cleanly, her hands steady despite the cold. "Good," he said. She looked up at him. "Really?" "Don't fish for compliments," he said. "It was good. You know it was." She smiled at that. A quick, real thing, over before it properly started, like she wasn't entirely comfortable letting it stay on her face. But he saw it. He turned back to the line and didn't say anything, but he noticed. The thing about living in close proximity with another person, Elias was discovering, was that it was impossible to sustain the kind of deliberate incuriosity he had maintained about other people for most of his adult life. At a distance, people were easy to keep at the level of general impression. Up close, day after day, in the specific demands of shared survival, they became particular. They became real in ways that were harder to manage. Clara was becoming very real to him. He knew now that she took her coffee strong and didn't add anything to it. That she hummed quietly when she was concentrating on something with her hands. Not a specific tune, just a low, absent sound. Like the humming was how her mind kept time. That she was left-handed, which he'd noticed first when she sewed and confirmed when she picked up an axe for the first time, and he'd had to redirect her grip. That she laughed rarely but genuinely, and when something genuinely struck her as funny, there was a half-second delay before it reached her face, as if laughter had to travel some distance from wherever she kept it. He knew that she woke some nights. He knew it because he slept lightly, always had. The mountain trained you to light sleeping. And he would hear her on the other side of the curtain, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was lying awake rather than sleeping. It happened 2 or 3 times a week. She never made noise about it. She just lay there in the dark until she found her way back to sleep, and in the morning she never mentioned it. He didn't ask, but he noticed, and the noticing became its own kind of weight. It was on one of those wakeful nights, somewhere in the 4th week, that he heard her get up. He heard her cross the floor quietly. She had learned to avoid the board near the east wall that creaked, and he heard the sound of her opening the small leather-bound ledger. Then silence. Then the scratch of pencil on paper. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. After a while he said quietly, "Clara." A pause. "I'm sorry," she said. "Did I wake you?" "No, I was already awake." He sat up. "What are you working on?" Another pause, and then the curtain shifted and she came partway through, holding the ledger and a stub of pencil, looking slightly embarrassed. "I was running the numbers again. I do it when I can't sleep. It helps me think." "What numbers?" She sat down at the table. He pulled on his boots and came to sit across from her, and she turned the ledger so he could see. "The February shortfall," she said. "The salt. I've been trying to find a way to make the supply stretch further than I projected." She'd been working in the ledger's margins, small figures crowded into the available space. "If we reduce salt use in the meat curing by 15% and rely more heavily on cold storage in the back of the larder, the temperature differential should do enough work to compensate if the cold holds through February." She pointed to a column of numbers. "But it only works if the temperature stays below 20 degrees consistently. If we get a warm spell—" "We won't," he said. "Not before March, not up here." She looked at him. "You're certain?" "I've done 11 winters. The cold holds." She studied him for a moment, then looked back at the numbers. "Then it works. We won't run short." She set the pencil down. "I just needed to know it was solved." He looked at her bent over the ledger in the firelight, pencil marks on her fingers, working the problem at 2 in the morning, because an unsolved problem would not let her rest, and he felt something shift in his chest, something quiet and inconvenient and entirely unwelcome. He looked away from it. "Go to sleep, Clara," he said. "I know, I will." She closed the ledger, but she didn't move immediately. She sat there for a moment, and when she looked up at him, there was something in her expression that was more open than she usually allowed herself in daylight hours. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Elias," he said. He wasn't sure when he'd decided that, but he said it. She blinked slightly. Then, "Elias." She said it like she was testing the weight of it. "I want you to know. I am aware that this arrangement has not been what you expected. When I arrived, I told you I would be useful, and I meant it. But I know the first weeks were more burden than help." She paused. "I'm trying to make that right." "You're not a burden," he said. "I was, in the beginning." "You were learning," he said. "That's different." She was quiet for a moment. "You're a fair man," she said. "Fairer than most I've known." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said nothing. "Good night, Elias," she said, and took the ledger back behind the curtain. He sat at the table for a while after that, the fire burning low, and tried to think about something else, and couldn't. Spring was still a long way off. He wasn't sure that was as much of a problem as he'd thought. The following days brought a rhythm that had its own kind of momentum. They fell into a working pattern that required almost no discussion. Who did what, when, in what order? As if the logic of the work itself had organized them into a partnership without either of them having to formally agree to one. He handled the traps and the heavy outdoor work. She managed the cabin's supplies and internal operations. But the lines between those territories blurred constantly, and neither of them seemed to mind. She was the one who noticed, one afternoon in late January, that his right boot had developed a crack in the sole. "Give it here," she said, at supper. He looked down. "It's fine. It's letting in water. In these temperatures, that means frostbite risk." She held out her hand. "Give me the boot." He looked at her outstretched hand. "I need the boot to wear," he said. "Not right now, you don't. You're sitting by the fire." She waggled her fingers impatiently. "Come on." I took off the boot and handed it over, feeling faintly ridiculous, sitting at his own table in one sock, while the woman he'd dragged in from the cold 3 weeks ago inspected his footwear with an expression of professional severity. She turned the boot over, examined the crack, pressed the sole experimentally. "Have you got any pine pitch?" she asked. "On the shelf by the door, the tin on the right." She got the tin, worked pine pitch into the crack with careful fingers, then bound the sole with a strip of leather cut from a piece of scrap she found on his workbench, stitching it in place with the same precise work she brought to everything that required a needle. She handed the boot back. "Wait an hour for the pitch to set," she said, and went back to her supper. He looked at the boot, then at her. She was already eating, entirely matter-of-fact about it, as if repairing his boot at the supper table was simply the next item on a list. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "You're welcome," she said, and then very quietly, "That's what partners do." He didn't answer, but something about the word, the ease with which she'd used it, the complete lack of self-consciousness, as if it were simply an accurate description of what they were, stayed with him for the rest of the evening, warm and uncomfortable in equal measure. It was the day after the boot repair that Gerald Holt made his first move. Elias was on the upper trap line when it happened, which meant he wasn't there for the beginning of it, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit when he thought about it afterward. He came back to the cabin in the mid-afternoon to find Clara standing in the main room, with her arms crossed and her jaw set in a way he hadn't seen on her before, tight and controlled, the expression of someone managing anger that they are not going to let out in front of the wrong person. On the table was a folded piece of paper. "What is it?" he asked, reading her face before he read the paper. "A man came up from town," she said. Her voice was even, too even. "One of Holt's men. He left that." Elias picked up the paper and read it. It was a letter, written in the precise hand of someone used to legal correspondence, stating that Gerald Holt had become aware that the payment made on Mrs. Whitmore's behalf in December had been made under conditions of duress and misrepresentation, and that additional review of the original debt instrument had revealed outstanding interest and penalties not covered by the December payment, amounting to $47. There was more. Legal language. References to unnamed statutes. A signature at the bottom that belonged to a lawyer whose name Elias didn't recognize, but whose address was listed as Cheyenne. He put the paper down. "He brought a lawyer into it," Elias said. "He brought the appearance of a lawyer into it," Clara said. She unfolded her arms and came to the table, turning the letter over in her hands with a controlled precision. "This is fraudulent." He looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because I kept records." She said it quietly, without triumph. "From the very beginning. The original loan. Every interaction Thomas had with Holt. Every conversation I had with him after Thomas died. I wrote it all down. Dates, amounts, exact words where I could remember them." She paused. "The debt Thomas owed was $120. No more. There were no penalty provisions in the original agreement. I found a copy of it in Thomas's papers, and I copied it out in my own ledger. There is no outstanding amount. You have documentation. I have enough to make Holt very uncomfortable if he wants to take this to a real court." She set the letter down. "The question is whether he knows that yet." Elias was quiet for a moment. "Did you tell his man anything?" "I told him the debt had been settled and that any further correspondence should go through proper legal channels." She paused. He laughed at me. Elias looked at her face, the controlled jaw, the steady eyes, the careful restraint over something that was very much not calm underneath. "That made you angry," he said. "Yes," she said, simply, without apology. "It did." "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good?" "Anger means you're taking it seriously instead of being afraid of it." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me what you have." She looked at him for a moment, something shifting in her expression. Then she went to her bag and brought out a second, smaller ledger. Not the household accounts one, but a different volume, older, the cover worn, and sat down across from him and opened it. It was meticulous. Dates going back 2 years, before Thomas Whitmore had died. Loan amounts. Repayment schedules as Thomas had apparently described them to Clara, annotated in her hand with her own assessments of their feasibility. The copy of the original loan document, reproduced in her careful handwriting. A timeline of her interactions with Holt after Thomas's death, dates of his visits, his exact demands as she remembered them, his escalating threats. Elias went through it page by page. When he got to the final section, the pages covering the last 4 months, leading up to the night in the saloon, he was quiet for a long time. "He threatened you multiple times before that night," he said. "Yes." "You wrote all of it down?" "Every time." She was watching him read. "I knew I needed witnesses or documentation. I couldn't get witnesses. Most of Raven Creek is afraid of Holt, or indebted to him, or both. So I documented everything I could." He turned another page. The last entry, dated the day after he'd paid the debt, read, "E. Carter paid debt in full, witnessed by approximately 15 persons. Room included J. Davies, T. Morse, B. and A. Kendrick, and others unknown. Holt accepted payment without condition." Without condition. 2 words. But in the right forum, 2 very significant words. He looked up at her. "You wrote this the next day," he said, "before you came up here." "The night after," she said. "I wrote it that night, in the back room of the boarding house where I was staying. And then in the morning, I packed my bag and walked up the mountain." He put the ledger down. I understood something now that he hadn't fully grasped before. The full shape of what Clara Whitmore had been doing since long before that night in the saloon. She hadn't just been surviving. She had been building a case, methodically and alone, without anyone knowing she was doing it, carrying that ledger through months of increasing threat and humiliation, and not letting any of it knock her off the purpose she'd set herself. The woman hadn't needed rescuing. She had needed one specific thing, one moment where the pressure was lifted enough that she could stand on her own footing again. He had given her that moment. The rest of it was entirely her own. "Holt doesn't know about this ledger," he said. "No." "He doesn't know what you have on him." "No." Elias leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He's going to keep pushing," he said. "This letter is the first move, not the last. When you don't pay the $47, he'll send someone up here again. Or he'll try something else." "I know," she said. "Which means you need to decide what you want to do with what you have." He looked at her directly. "You could go to the county seat, get a real lawyer, take Holt to court." "I know I could." She was quiet for a moment. "I've thought about it." "And?" She folded her hands on the table. "A court case takes money I don't have, time I don't have, and requires me to go back into a place where Holt has influence, and I have almost none. Even if I win, and I believe I would win, the process itself could ruin me." She paused. "I want the option to do it. I'm not ready to commit to it." "All right," he said. "But I want him to know I have it," she said. Her voice had shifted slightly, firmer, quieter, with something underneath it that he was starting to recognize as her version of dangerous. "I want him to know that I am not the same woman who stood in that saloon, that the terms have changed." Elias looked at her for a long moment. "I'll ride down tomorrow," he said, "and I'll have a conversation with Holt." She shook her head immediately. "No." He blinked. "No? No." She said it firmly, but without heat. "I don't want you to fight my battles for me, Elias. I told you that from the beginning. I need, to handle this myself, with my own name and my own evidence and my own words." She held his gaze. "If Holt sees you riding in to defend me, he'll assume I have no power of my own. He needs to understand that I do." Elias was quiet. "I'll ride down with you," he said. "I won't say anything unless you need me to." She considered that for a moment. "All right," she said. "That's different." They were quiet for a moment, the ledger open between them, the fire working steadily in the stove. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "Why didn't you tell me about this before? The ledger, what you had on Holt?" She held his gaze for a moment. "Because it was mine," she said simply. "The one thing I had that was entirely mine. I wasn't ready to share it." She paused. "I trust you now. I didn't then. Not all the way." He understood that. He would have felt the same. 3 days passed before they rode down to Raven Creek. In those 3 days, a late January cold snap hit, the worst temperatures of the season so far. And they were confined largely to the cabin, which meant they were in each other's company for longer, unbroken stretches than they'd yet managed. It was in those 3 days that Elias learned she could argue, not bicker, not complain. Argue. Real, structural disagreement, with positions and reasoning, and the willingness to push back against his positions with her own. It started with something small. He'd decided to modify the trap line based on tracks he'd seen the previous week, and she disagreed with the modification. "If you move those 2 sets," she said over breakfast on the second morning of the cold snap, "you're pulling coverage from the east corridor. Whatever moved through there last week, it'll move through again." "The sign on the west slope is more recent," he said. "More recent doesn't mean more productive." She leaned forward. "The east corridor has been consistently active all winter. You've told me that yourself. One good week on the west slope isn't a pattern. I've been trapping this mountain for 11 years, he said. "I know you have." She didn't flinch. "And you know more about this mountain than I will in my lifetime. But you're making this decision based on what you saw last week, and I'm making mine based on everything you've told me about the whole season. Those are different data sets." He looked at her. She looked back. "2 sets west," he said finally. "I'll leave 1 on the east." "Leave 2 on the east," she said. A pause. 1.5, he said. She stared at him. "You can't have half a trap set." "I'm aware. I'm being rhetorical." She blinked, and then she laughed. The real kind, with the half-second delay and the complete surprise in her face, like she'd caught herself off guard. And he felt something happen in his chest that he really would have preferred not to feel. He turned back to his breakfast before she could see his face. "Fine," he said. "2 east." "Thank you," she said, still with traces of the laugh. "Don't thank me. You might be wrong." "I might be," she agreed cheerfully. "But I don't think I am." She wasn't. The east corridor turned in 3 animals over the next 4 days, while the west sets came up empty. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. But the next time they discussed the line, she pulled the map off the wall herself and started the conversation, and he listened, and they reached their decisions together without either of them having to say that that was what they were doing. That was the 2nd week of February. The morning they finally rode down to Raven Creek, Clara was up before him, which had never happened before. He came through the curtain to find her already dressed, the small ledger tucked under her arm, her hair pinned up in the way she saved for deliberate occasions. She had ironed her dress, somehow, using the flat surface of the stove and a folded cloth. And she was standing by the window with the expression of someone who has been running through a conversation in their head for days and is now simply waiting for it to happen. She looked formidable. She looked, he thought, like someone who had decided exactly how far she was willing to be pushed and had drawn the line in permanent ink. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready," she said. They rode side by side down the mountain trail in the pale winter light, the horses moving steadily through the packed snow. She didn't speak much on the ride down. He didn't either. He understood the kind of quiet she needed before something like this. He'd felt it himself before difficult things. And he gave it to her without question. They rode into Raven Creek at mid-morning. People noticed them. Elias had expected that. What he hadn't quite anticipated was the specific quality of the attention. Not just curiosity, but something more like reassessment. As if the sight of Clara Whitmore riding into town on horseback, straight-backed and composed, had forced a revision of an image people had settled into. The woman they'd last seen being dismantled in a saloon was not the woman who had just come down off a mountain. Clara didn't look at the watchers. She rode directly to the merchant's office on the north end of the main street, tied her horse without haste, and walked through the door with the ledger under her arm and Elias 3 steps behind her. Gerald Holt was behind his counter when they walked in. The pleasant expression settled over his face like a mask being fitted. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "And Mr. Carter, was it?" "The letter you sent is fraudulent," Clara said. She didn't wait for pleasantries, and she didn't raise her voice. She placed the ledger on his counter and opened it to the page she'd marked. The original loan agreement contained no penalty provisions. I have a copy of it here, in Thomas's hand. You accepted payment in full in December, in front of witnesses whose names I have recorded. She turned the page. If you send another letter or another man to my door, I will take this ledger to the county seat, and I will stand in front of a judge and read it aloud. Every entry, every date, every threat. She closed the ledger. I am not afraid of you, Mr. Holt. I want you to understand that specifically. I am not afraid of you. Holt looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. He stood where he was, hands at his sides, expression neutral. Holt understood what neutral meant. He looked back at Clara. Something moved behind the pale eyes. Calculation, reassessment, the specific movement of a man deciding whether a fight was worth the cost and arriving, reluctantly, at an answer. The matter, Holt said finally, very carefully, appears to have been resolved. Yes, Clara said. It does. She picked up the ledger. She walked out. Elias followed her. On the porch, in the cold winter air, she stopped. She put one hand briefly against the porch post. Not for support, just contact, just something solid, while she let out a slow breath. You all right? He asked quietly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. I'm all right. She looked at him sidelong. You didn't say a word in there. I didn't need to, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something layered, something with more than one thing in it. And then she said, very quietly, No, you didn't. They mounted up and rode north, back toward the mountain, and she didn't speak again until they were past the edge of town and the trail began to climb. Elias, she said. Yeah. Thank you for being there. He looked at her profile against the gray winter sky. The set of her shoulders, the steadiness in her face, the ledger tucked under her arm like a weapon she'd built herself and carried alone for months before anyone knew she had it. You didn't need me, he said. No, she agreed. But I wanted you there. A pause. That's a different thing. He turned back to the trail. He understood the difference. He understood, riding up that mountain with Clara Whitmore at his side in the winter light, that the difference between needing and wanting was exactly the thing he had spent 11 years on this mountain failing to reckon with. And somewhere on that trail, without either of them saying anything about it, something between them quietly and irreversibly changed. He didn't know what to do about it yet. He suspected she did. He suspected she had known for a while and was giving him the time to catch up. The mountain rose ahead of them, cold and clear and indifferent as always. And for the first time in 11 winters, Elias Carter found himself genuinely glad to be going home. The ride back up the mountain that afternoon was quieter than the ride down, and it wasn't the same kind of quiet. On the way down, Clara had been in her head, running through the confrontation, steeling herself, building the architecture of what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. Elias had recognized that kind of silence because he'd lived inside it himself more times than he could count. It was the silence of someone gathering themselves before a hard thing. On the way back, the silence was different. It was the silence that comes after. She rode with her shoulders lower than they'd been in weeks. Not defeated. Nothing like defeated. More like a woman who had been carrying a particular weight for so long that the absence of it was taking some getting used to. Her hands were relaxed on the reins. Her breathing was slow. Twice he glanced over at her and found her looking at the trail ahead with an expression he could only describe as quiet. Genuinely, actually quiet, in a way he hadn't seen her be since she'd knocked on his cabin door in the snow. They were halfway up the trail when she said, without looking at him, "I've been waiting to do that for 7 months." "I know," he said. "I used to lie awake in that boarding house and practice what I'd say to him. How I'd say it." She paused. "It never felt real when I practiced it. It felt like pretending." "It didn't look like pretending today," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It didn't feel like it either." Another pause. I think I needed to not be afraid first, before I could do it. And I don't know exactly when the fear went away, but somewhere on this mountain it did." She looked over at him then, briefly. "I think you had something to do with that." He kept his eyes on the trail. "You did the work," he said. "I did," she agreed. "But you gave me the ground to stand on while I was doing it." She turned back to the trail. "That matters, Elias. Don't tell me it doesn't." He didn't tell her it didn't. He wouldn't have been believed anyway. That evening, back in the cabin with the horses stabled and the fire rebuilt and supper cooking on the stove, something had shifted between them in a way that was palpable, even without either of them acknowledging it directly. They moved around each other in the small space with a new kind of ease, less careful about proximity, less deliberate about distance, as if the confrontation in town had settled something that had been unsettled between them for weeks. She was at the stove when he came in from the stable, and she handed him a cup of coffee without being asked, and he took it without comment. And neither of them thought anything of it until a moment later, when he realized that she had known, without asking, how long he'd been outside, and that he'd be cold and want it. He looked at the cup. She was already back at the stove. He drank the coffee and said nothing. But he thought about it. February moved into its second half, and the mountain held its cold the way Clara had predicted it would. Steady and reliable, the temperatures dropping hard at night and climbing only reluctantly during the short gray days. It was the deepest part of winter, the part that tested people, and the cabin felt different in it than it had before. Warmer, for one thing. Literally. She'd found and sealed 3 drafts he'd been unconsciously compensating for years, and the stove's heat now stayed where it was put instead of bleeding out through the wall joints. But warmer in the other sense too, the one that had nothing to do with temperature. He noticed it in small things. She'd started leaving his coat on the hook nearest the door so he could reach it fast when he went out. He'd started timing his trapline check so he got back before she started cooking, because she cooked better with 2 people. Or he had come to believe she did, which amounted to the same thing. She had learned the names of his horses and spoke to them when she worked around the stable, and he had caught himself, more than once, pausing outside the stable door to listen to the sound of her talking to them before he went in. I was aware that he was in trouble. He was not sure what to do about it. The thing about Elias Carter was that he had not always been a solitary man by nature. He had been made into one, step by step, by a specific sequence of events that had started when he was 22 years old and ended when he was 23, with enough pain to last a lifetime. He had not allowed himself to examine those events in some years, not because he'd forgotten them, but because he had learned that examination served no purpose. The past was the past. The mountain asked for presence, not history. But Clara's arrival had a way of making the past present again. Not because she reminded him of anyone or anything from before. She was entirely herself, distinct and specific and unlike anyone he'd known. But because watching her, the way she worked, the way she thought, the way she handled difficulty without looking for someone to carry it for her, had put something in front of him that he'd spent 11 years persuading himself he didn't need. Evidence that another person could be trusted. He hadn't realized, entirely, how much the lack of that evidence had cost him. On the 3rd morning after the confrontation in town, he told her. Not all of it. Not the whole sequence. But enough. They were at the table after breakfast, the ledger open between them for the morning supply review, when he said, without particular preamble, "I wasn't always up here alone." She looked up from the ledger. He kept his eyes on the table. "There was a woman," he said. 10, 11 years ago, before the mountain. A pause. "Her name was May. I thought we'd—" He stopped, tried again. "I had plans." A homestead. Something permanent. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. She left. It wasn't complicated. She wanted a different kind of life than I could give her, and she was right to go. But Another stop. I didn't handle it well. I came up here to stop handling things badly, and I stayed because the mountain made sense to me in a way that people mostly didn't. Clara was quiet. She wasn't looking at the ledger anymore. I'm not telling you this because I want sympathy, he said. I'm telling you because you told me something the other night, about the ledger, about trust. He finally looked up at her. I figured I owed you the same. She held his gaze for a long moment. Did you love her? She asked. Quietly, without prying. More like she needed the map accurate if she was going to navigate by it. I thought I did, he said. I'm not sure now that I knew what I was talking about. She nodded slowly. Thomas and I, she started, and then paused, organizing something. We cared for each other, genuinely. But I think we were also both a little lonely and a little afraid, and we found each other at the right moment to mistake those things for something bigger. She looked down at her hands. I don't say that without kindness toward him. He was a good man. He just wasn't. We weren't. She stopped. You don't have to explain it, he said. I know. She looked up. I want to, though. I want you to know that I'm not a woman in mourning who came up a mountain and got confused. I know my own mind. She said it without defensiveness, just precision. I want to be clear about that. He looked at her. The fire worked steadily in the stove. I hear you, he said. She nodded once. They went back to the ledger. But the air in the cabin had changed again, and this time, both of them knew it. It was 2 days after that conversation. A morning at the end of February, the kind of morning that carries the first faint suggestion that winter might eventually end, though it wasn't yet ready to commit to it, when the trouble came back. Not a letter this time. Riders. Elias saw them first, from the upper trap line. 3 horses on the trail below, moving at a pace that wasn't casual. He counted them and identified the horses, not Raven Creek mounts, or not ones he recognized, and felt a specific quality of unease settle over him that he associated with situations that were about to require decisions. He moved fast. He made it back to the cabin 20 minutes ahead of them, which gave him enough time to tell Clara what was coming, but not much more than that. 3 riders, he said, coming through the door and reaching for his rifle without breaking stride. Don't know them. They're coming deliberate. Clara was on her feet immediately. Holt, she said. Don't know yet. He checked the load on the rifle, set it against the wall near the door. Stay inside until I know who they are. She went to the window. I'm not hiding, she said. I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to let me assess the situation first. He met her eyes. Give me 30 seconds, that's all. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she stepped back from the window. He went out onto the porch. The 3 riders came up the last slope and pulled up in front of the cabin with the particular arrangement of men who have thought about how they were going to present themselves. 1 in front, 2 flanking, giving the impression of official weight without necessarily having any. The man in front was someone Elias didn't know. Mid-40s, well-fed, wearing a coat that was too good for the weather and an expression that had been arranged to suggest authority. He had papers in his hand. The 2 behind him were younger and harder looking, and they had the posture of men who were paid to stand where they were put. Looking for a woman, the man in front said. Clara Whitmore. I'm told she's here. Who's asking? Elias said. R.D. Marsh. I represent legal interests in this matter. He held up the papers. I have a writ. What kind of writ? Marsh smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. The kind that requires Mrs. Whitmore to return to Raven Creek to address outstanding obligations. He paused. I'd rather handle this civilly, Mr. Carter. I'm told that's your name. Elias said nothing. The writ is lawful, Marsh continued. I'd suggest, let me see it. Elias came off the porch and held out his hand. Marsh's smile tightened. He handed the papers over. Elias read them. He read them twice, slowly, because he wanted to be sure of what he was seeing. It took him a moment because the language was designed to be difficult to read quickly. Dense legal phrasing, references to statutes, the kind of document that was meant to overwhelm someone who didn't know what they were looking at. But he did know what he was looking at. And what he was looking at was a document that named Clara Whitmore as owing a debt to Gerald Holt. Not the original $120 or the fraudulent $47, but a new figure entirely, $340, attributed to damages arising from breach of commercial agreement and willful abandonment of residence during period of outstanding obligation. He looked up from the papers. "This is fabricated," he said. Marsh's expression didn't change. "The writ is executed by a judge of Laramie County." "Which judge?" A slight pause. "Judge Harlan." Elias had never heard of a Judge Harlan in Laramie County. That didn't necessarily mean anything, but it meant something. "I'll need to verify that," he said. "You're welcome to," Marsh said. In the meantime," said Clara, from directly behind Elias, "I'd like to see those papers." He hadn't heard her come out. He didn't turn around, but he moved slightly to the side so she had room. She stepped up beside him, not behind him, beside him, and took the papers from his hand without asking and read them herself. He watched her read, the particular speed of her eyes, the way her expression went from intent to very still when she reached certain passages. When she looked up, she looked at Marsh. "This debt doesn't exist," she said. The original obligation was settled in full in December, witnessed by no fewer than 15 persons in Raven Creek. The secondary claim of $47 was fraudulent, and Mr. Holt was so informed to his face 10 days ago. She held the papers out. "This document is the third attempt to manufacture a legal basis for something that has no legal basis. I have records of all three attempts, with dates and details." Marsh looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected less. "Ma'am," he said, with careful condescension, "the writ was signed by a Judge Harlan," she said. "I'd like the court number of the writ and the docket entry, standard procedural information that any legitimately filed document would carry." She tapped the papers. "I don't see it here." Marsh said nothing. "Because it isn't there," she said. "Because this document was not filed with any court." One of the men behind Marsh shifted in his saddle. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marsh said, and his voice had changed, the authority draining out of it, something harder and less pleasant taking its place. "I'd advise you to reconsider the position you're—" "My position," Clara said, "is that I am a woman standing on private land with documentation that would embarrass Gerald Holt in front of any legitimate court in Wyoming territory. My position is that the next time someone comes to this cabin with papers, those papers had better be real." She looked at the papers in his hand. "And my position is that you should go back to Raven Creek and tell Mr. Holt that I said so." The silence on the mountain was the kind that had weight. Marsh looked at the papers. He looked at Clara. He looked at Elias, who had not said anything and had not moved, and whose rifle was visible leaning against the porch post behind them. Then he looked back at Clara. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "I've made mistakes," she said. "I know what they feel like. This isn't one." Marsh pulled his horse around without another word. The two men behind him followed. They rode back down the trail and didn't look back. Elias waited until the sound of hoofbeats had fully faded. Then he said, "Where'd you learn about court docket numbers?" Clara let out a breath, slow and controlled, the kind that disposes of something you've been holding onto for the length of a conversation. "My father had a legal dispute once," she said. "When I was 14. It went to court. I sat through every session." She looked at the trail where the riders had gone. "Fake writs don't have docket numbers, real ones always do." He looked at her. She turned and met his eyes, and what was in her face wasn't triumph exactly. It was something more complicated than that. Something that had resolve in it, and anger, and a thin edge of fear that she hadn't shown during the confrontation itself, but that she was allowing now that the men were gone. "He's not going to stop," she said. Quiet, certain. "Holt. He's not going to accept that he's lost this." "No," Elias agreed. "He's not." Then we need to do something he can't ignore. She looked at him directly. I need to take the ledger to the county seat. I need to file a complaint formally, with a real court, before he finds a way to get ahead of me. Elias studied her. That's a 3-day ride, he said. In February. I know. You'd need someone who knew the route. I know that too. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to come. I'm telling you what I need to do and letting you decide what part, if any, you want in it. He looked at her for a long moment. This was the thing about Clara Whitmore that continued to catch him off guard. Even now, after 2 months of daily proximity, she never assumed. She never presumed. She staked out exactly what she needed and what she was doing and left the space around it entirely open. It was a quality he associated, in his experience, with the rarest kind of people, the ones who had been through enough to understand that nothing worth having could be coerced. I know the route, he said. She held her breath. We leave day after tomorrow, he said. Gives us time to prepare, and for the weather window to open. There's a warm gap coming. I can feel it in the air. He turned back toward the cabin. And Clara? She was already looking at him. Bring everything you have in that ledger, he said. Every page. We do this. We do it completely. Something moved across her face. Too fast to fully catch, like a flash of light that was there and then wasn't. And she said very quietly, Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Start packing. The 2 days of preparation had a particular quality to them. Purposeful and focused in a way that stripped away the ambiguity that had been building between them and replaced it with something cleaner. They had a task, a direction, a thing to do that required all their attention and left less room for the kind of sideways awareness of each other that had been making both of them careful. Or that was what Elias told himself. It was mostly true. He prepared the horses, checked his rifle and his sidearm, laid out provisions for 3 days on the trail. She organized her documentation, made fair copies of the most critical ledger entries onto clean paper so that the judge would have something legible, and wrote a careful accounting of every event from December through the visit from Marsh that laid out the sequence in the kind of logical order that was designed to be read by someone official. She read him the accounting on the evening before they left. She sat across from him at the table, papers in hand, and read it aloud. All of it, start to finish, in a clear and even voice. It took nearly 30 minutes. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Is there anything I should add? She asked. The part about the boots, he said. She blinked. What? Marsh's men. One of them had Raven Creek livery marks on his saddle blanket. It means Holt hired locally. He paused. It connects Holt directly to the attempt. Harder to deny he organized it if his own livery's blankets were on the horses. She stared at him. I didn't notice that, she said. I did. She picked up her pen and added it to the account. When she set the pen down, she looked at him across the table with an expression he had been avoiding looking at directly for several weeks because he had known, every time he caught the edge of it, that it was going to require him to do something about it eventually. Elias, she said. Yeah. I want to say something and I want you to hear it without arguing with it. He looked at her. You could have stepped back at any point, she said. From the beginning. In the saloon you could have walked past. On the mountain you could have told me to leave after the first week. When Holt's men came, you could have sent me to deal with it alone. Every step of this, you've had the option to be less involved than you are. She paused. You haven't taken any of those options. He was quiet. I noticed that, she said. I noticed that very clearly. Clara, I'm not finished. She said it gently, but firmly. I don't know what you are to yourself, Elias Carter. I don't know how you explain yourself to yourself. But from where I sit, you are the most present person I have ever known. Not in the loud way, not in the way that makes a show of it, just present, steady, there when it matters. She looked at him directly. That's a rare thing. I want you to know that I know it. He sat with that for a moment. The fire burned. You're not easy to be around, he said finally. She looked surprised. Not in a bad way, he said. Just, You see things clearly. You say what you see. Most people don't do that. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It takes some getting used to. Something softened in her expression. Is that a complaint? She asked. No, he said. It's not. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the conversation they were technically having. Then she gathered her papers. Get some sleep, she said. We leave at first light. He watched her go behind the curtain. He sat at the table for a long time after, the cabin quiet around him, the fire settling into coals. Howe was not a man who made decisions quickly or without examination. He had learned, the hard way, the cost of moving fast on things that mattered, and he had compensated perhaps too far in the other direction. Too slow, too cautious, too willing to let important things remain unspoken, because speaking them meant committing to their reality. But he was sitting in the cabin that was warmer than it had been in 11 years, talking to a woman who read fake rights for missing docket numbers, and kept records of everything, and hummed when she worked, and laughed with a half-second delay, and had walked 6 miles up a mountain in the snow to return a debt she hadn't owed. He thought about what she'd said. Present, steady, there when it matters. He thought about what he hadn't said back, which was that the same was true of her, which was that he had spent 11 years on this mountain being present and steady and alone, and for the first time in all those years, steady didn't feel like something he was doing for its own sake. It felt like something he was doing for someone. He went to sleep before he could follow that thought any further. But in the morning, when he came through the curtain at first light and found her already up, already dressed, already at the window, with the quiet, alert expression of someone ready to begin, when she turned and looked at him and said simply, "Ready?" He understood that the thought hadn't actually needed to go anywhere further. He understood where it had already been for some time. "Ready," he said, and they went out together into the cold before dawn, and saddled the horses in the dark, and turned south toward the county seat with Clara's ledger and everything she'd built inside it. And Elias Carter rode with his rifle across his saddle, and his eyes on the trail, and the particular feeling of a man who has been alone for a very long time and has finally stopped pretending that's the same as being fine. The mountain fell away behind them. The real fight was just beginning. The trail south was 3 days of hard riding through February cold, and by the end of the first day, Elias had stopped thinking about the county seat and started thinking about Clara. Not in the complicated way he'd been thinking about her in the cabin, the sideways, careful thinking of a man trying not to look directly at something. Simpler than that, more immediate. He was thinking about the way she sat her horse, which was competent without being showy, the kind of riding that said she'd done it before, but hadn't spent her life at it. He was thinking about the way she read the trail, picking up things, asking questions about what she saw, connecting the answers to what she already knew in ways that consistently surprised him. He was thinking about the fact that she hadn't complained once, not about the cold, not about the pace, not about the provisions he'd packed, which were adequate but not generous. They made camp the first night in a stand of timber off the main trail, where the trees cut the wind enough to make a fire worthwhile. He built it, and she produced, from her bag, a small wrapped bundle of food she'd prepared before leaving, bread and dried meat and 2 boiled eggs, and they ate without ceremony, close to the fire, their breath visible in the dark air. "Tell me about the county seat," she said. "Laramie?" He poured coffee from the pot he'd set on the edge of the fire. "Bigger than Raven Creek. Actual courthouse. Real judge." "Have you been there before?" "Several times. To register my land and file my trapping license." He handed her the coffee. "I know where the courthouse is. I know who the clerk is. Man named Patterson. Honest, methodical, not afraid of Holt, because he's never heard of Holt." "That's good," she said. "It helps." She turned the tin cup in her hands. "Do you think the judge will hear the case?" "Filing a formal complaint doesn't require a case," he said. "It requires a record. Patterson will log it, date it, assign it a number. After that, Holt knows that any move he makes is documented before he makes it." He looked at her over the fire. "That's the point. Not to beat him in court. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The point is to make the cost of continuing too high. She was quiet for a moment. You understand legal process better than you let on, she said. I've had to learn things I didn't expect to need, he said. Land disputes up here aren't uncommon. Men claiming boundary lines that don't exist. I've dealt with my share. She studied him. What else don't I know about you? She asked. Not coy, just genuinely curious. He thought about it. I read, he said. A lot. People assume, looking at me, that I don't. I do. What do you read? Whatever I can get. History, mostly. Some law. I had a teacher once, before I left Ohio, who told me that a man who didn't read was a man who let other people do his thinking for him. He paused. I took that seriously. Ohio, she said. You're from Ohio. Born there, left when I was 19. So am I. She said it with a slight widening of her eyes, the expression of someone who has found unexpected common ground. Medina County. Stark, he said. She looked at him for a moment. We might have passed within 30 miles of each other and never known it. Different people then, he said. Yes, she agreed. Very different. The fire snapped between them. He looked at her across it. The way the light moved on her face, the particular quality of stillness she had in the evenings when the day's work was done, and she stopped managing herself quite so carefully. He'd noticed it first in the cabin, that slight evening loosening, like a knot that unwound just enough to let something real show through. Clara, he said. She looked at him. He almost said it. He was closer than he'd been before, sitting there in the dark 3 days' ride from the mountain, with no walls between them and nothing requiring his attention except the fire and her face. He almost said it. Instead, he said, "Try to sleep. Early start tomorrow." Something moved in her expression. Not disappointment exactly, but close. She recognized what he'd done, and she let him do it, and she didn't make anything of it. "Good night, Elias," she said, and pulled her blanket around herself and turned toward the fire. He sat up for another hour, feeding the fire and listening to the dark, and tried to think about what he was going to say to Patterson at the courthouse, and thought about Clara instead. The second day's riding brought them within sight of Laramie by late afternoon, and the sight of it, the cluster of buildings, the sound of actual human density after months of mountain silence, seemed to affect Clara in a way she hadn't expected. He watched her take it in and go quiet in a specific way that wasn't peaceful. "You all right?" he asked. "I forgot what it looked like," she said. "A town. 2 months on a mountain will do that. It's not just the town." She kept her eyes forward. "The last time I was in a place this size, everything was falling apart. I was 4 months behind on the boarding house rent. I was afraid of running into Holt's men every time I went out." A pause. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to walk into a place without that." "How does it feel now?" She considered it. "Different," she said. "I feel different." He believed her. He could see it in how she carried herself. Not the careful, contained posture she'd worn in those early weeks, but something fuller, something that took up its proper space. They found a boarding house on the east side of the main street. 2 rooms, which he paid for without discussion, and she didn't argue because they both understood it as logistics rather than anything more complex. They put the horses up, ate a real supper at a table inside with other people around them. The first time either of them had done that in months. And Elias watched Clara navigate the social environment of the dining room with the same careful attentiveness she brought to everything unfamiliar. She watched people. She listened to the conversations around them without being obvious about it. By the time supper was over, she had read the room the way she read the mountain, cataloging, assessing, filing. "The man at the corner table," she said quietly as they left. "The one with the ledger." "Saw him," Elias said. "He's a lawyer." Elias glanced back, curious. "How do you know?" "The way he reads the ledger, not like a businessman, no reaction to the numbers. He's reading it the way I read contracts, looking for structure." She was quiet for a moment. "I might want to speak with him tomorrow, depending on how the clerk goes." Elias looked at her sideways. 3 months ago, she'd been begging a merchant in a frontier saloon for more time. "Whatever you need," he said. The clerk's office at the courthouse opened at 8 in the morning. They were there at 7:45. Patterson was a thin, precise man in his 50s, with the organized efficiency of someone who had spent decades making sure that the machinery of official record worked correctly, and who took a particular professional pride in that function. Elias introduced himself and explained that Mrs. Whitmore needed to file a formal complaint. Patterson looked at Clara. Clara placed the ledger on his counter and opened it to the first marked page. "I need to file a comprehensive record of fraudulent debt claims," she said. 3 separate attempts over a period of 2 months, each building on the previous one, each fraudulent. She laid the copies she'd made, the clean transcriptions on fresh paper, alongside the ledger. "I have primary documentation, dated entries, and in the case of the most recent incident, physical evidence connecting the complainant's agent to the complainant's own business." Patterson looked at the papers. He looked at Clara. He looked at the papers again. "Who is the complainant?" he asked. "Gerald Holt," she said. "Merchant, Raven Creek, Wyoming Territory." Patterson picked up the first page and read it. He read for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he set it down, picked up his pen, and said, "Start from the beginning, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll need your account in full." She talked for 40 minutes. Elias stood to one side and listened to her lay it out. The sequence of events, the documentation, the witnesses, the fraudulent writ and its missing docket number, the livery marks on the horses. And he watched Patterson's face as she talked. And he watched Patterson go from professional neutrality to a specific kind of careful attention that men in his position reserved for cases that had real teeth. When she finished, Patterson was quiet for a moment. "The writ," he said. "The one Marsh presented. You're certain it had no docket number?" "Certain," she said. "I've seen legitimate court documents. I know what they carry." "And you have this in writing? Your account of the Marsh visit?" She placed the page on the counter. He read it. "The livery marks," he said. "Raven Creek livery. My account specifies the design. A double-bar brand on the left blanket corner. If someone were to check the livery's records for a rental transaction around that date, that would be a matter for the sheriff of Raven Creek or the territorial marshal," Patterson said. He was already writing. "But the complaint creates the basis for that inquiry." He looked up at her over his glasses. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to be direct with you. What you've brought me today is unusually well documented for a complaint of this nature. Most people who've been in your position arrive here with nothing but their own word." He looked at the ledger. "You've made my job very straightforward." Something in Clara's face, barely visible, a slight easing around the eyes, said that she'd been holding more tension in her body than she'd shown. "How long does the filing take?" she asked. "I'll have the complaint logged and numbered by end of business today," he said. "You'll have a copy to take with you. I'll forward the filing to the territorial court in Cheyenne and to the marshal's office." He picked up his pen again. "If Mr. Holt makes any further claims against you, he does so against a matter of official record. A legitimate attorney will tell him immediately that this is a losing position." "Thank you, Mr. Patterson," she said. "Thank the records you kept," he said, and went back to his writing. They stepped outside into the February air. Clara stood on the courthouse steps and didn't move for a moment. She looked at the street in front of her, at the ordinary movement of an ordinary town going about its ordinary morning, and she was very still with something moving through her that she wasn't quite managing to contain. Elias stood beside her and let her be. After a moment she said, "It's done." "It's done," he agreed. "He can't touch me now." She said it quietly, like she was testing the truth of it. "He can try, but there's a record. There's an official record with a number." "Yes." She turned and looked at him. Her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set, and she looked like someone trying to decide whether to cry or laugh and settling for neither. "I want to go back," she said. "I want to go back to the mountain." Something in his chest moved. "We can leave tomorrow morning," he said. "No," she said. "Today." He looked at her. "We need Patterson's copy of the filing," he said. He said end of business. "Then we wait for it," she said. "And then we go." He nodded. They collected the copy at 4 in the afternoon. A crisp official document with a docket number and Patterson's signature and the seal of the territorial court. Clara folded it with the same careful precision she brought to everything and placed it in the ledger between two pieces of stiff paper to protect it, and she did it all very calmly, and then she said, "Can we please go now?" He had the horses saddled in 20 minutes. They rode north out of Laramie as the sun was getting low, making 5 miles before full dark and camping in a hollow where the wind was blocked. It was colder than the previous night, and they built the fire bigger, and Clara sat close to it with the ledger in her lap and the filed copy inside it, and she didn't hum tonight, and she didn't work. She just sat and looked at the fire. "Say what you're thinking," Elias said. She looked at him. "I'm thinking about Thomas," she said. "About what he'd think of all this." She paused. "He was a careful man. Responsible. He would have hated knowing he'd left me in this position." A pause. "I used to be angry about that. That he didn't tell me what was happening with Holt. That he tried to manage it alone and couldn't, and didn't give me the chance to help." She looked back at the fire. "I'm not angry anymore." "What are you instead?" She thought about it for a moment. "Grateful," she said. "Which sounds strange. But if Thomas hadn't—" She stopped. "If things had gone differently, I'd still be in Ohio helping my father balance accounts. I wouldn't have come west. I wouldn't have been in Raven Creek." She looked at him steadily across the fire. "I wouldn't have been in that saloon." He held her gaze. The fire cracked between them. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. Not yes what. Just yes. As if she knew exactly where the sentence was going and was answering the part he hadn't said yet. He looked at the fire for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. "I want you to know that going in. I spent 11 years being alone on purpose, and I got very good at it, and now I'm—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at saying things directly." "You're doing all right," she said quietly. "I want you to stay," he said. "On the mountain. I want you to stay, not because we made an arrangement, not because of the debt, not because of Holt." He looked at her directly. "I want you to stay because when I ride back to that cabin, I want you to be in it. Because this winter has been the first winter in 11 years that felt like something other than enduring." He paused. "And because you are the most capable, most clear-eyed, you are the most real person I have ever known, and I don't want to stop knowing you." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She didn't rush to fill the silence, which was one of the things he valued most about her. "Elias Carter," she said finally, "that is the most words I have ever heard you say at one time." He felt something that wasn't quite a smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "Don't get used to it." "I might," she said. And then, quieter. "I want to stay. I've known for a while that I wanted to stay. I was waiting for you to know it too." She held his gaze. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have my sister in Ohio and I have enough now, with the filing done, to build something of my own if I chose to. I want you to understand that." She paused. "I'm staying because I choose to. The same way I chose to come up that mountain in the first place." "I understand the difference," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's part of why." They sat by the fire for a long time after that without speaking, and it was the most comfortable silence Elias could remember being inside, in as long as he could account for. Not the silence of two people avoiding something. The silence of two people who had said what needed to be said, and were now simply present with each other in the cold and the dark and the firelight, and found it enough, more than enough. He reached across and covered her hand where it rested on the ledger. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed that way until the fire burned low, and neither of them made anything more of it that night, and neither of them needed to. The ride back to the mountain took 2.5 days. The weather held, the trail was clear, and they rode side by side most of the way, talking in the easy way of people who have stopped being careful with each other, about Ohio, about the mountain, about the spring that was still a month away, but coming whether the cold acknowledged it or not. She told him about her father's general store, about the satisfaction she'd taken as a girl in the perfect logic of a balanced ledger, about the way numbers had always felt more honest to her than most other things, because numbers couldn't be manipulated the way words could without eventually showing the lie. He told her about the mountain the first winter, how he'd almost died in January when a fall through ice on the creek had left him soaked and a mile from the cabin, and what had gotten him through it, which had been nothing more or less than the specific mechanical stubbornness of a man who hadn't yet figured out what he was stubborn for. "And now?" she said. He looked over at her. "Now I know," he said. She smiled at that. The full one, not the quick one she usually allowed herself. They were half a day from the mountain when they found the tracks. Elias saw them first, on the trail north of the creek crossing, and he stopped his horse without warning, and Clara pulled up beside him and looked at his face before she looked at the ground. "What is it?" she said. "Tracks," he said. "3 horses, coming from the west." He looked at the trail ahead, going north. "Toward the cabin," she said. "Yes." She looked at the tracks, then at him. "How old?" she said. "This morning," he said. "No more." They looked at each other. "Holt," she said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know," he said, "but we need to move." He looked at her directly. "If something's happened to the cabin, then we deal with it," she said. Her voice was even and her back was straight. "Let's go." They pushed the horses hard for the next 3 hours. Howe was aware, riding that stretch, of what had shifted between them in the last 3 days. Not the words they'd said at the fire, but what was underneath the words, the actual substance of it. He was not riding toward this situation alone, and that was not a problem, and that was new. The cabin came into sight in the late afternoon, and he pulled up at the tree line and sat there for a long moment reading it. The closed door, the smoke rising from the chimney, the horses tied out front. 3 horses. Clara came up beside him. She saw the horses. She counted them. She opened her saddlebag and took out the ledger. "I'm taking this in with me," she said. "You're not going in first," he said. "I'm not asking to." She met his eyes. "But I'm going in. We do this together." He looked at her. He thought about the saloon in December. The woman who had stood there with her purse pressed against her stomach like a shield, looking up at Holt while the room watched and did nothing. He looked at the woman beside him now. Same woman. Entirely different person. "Together," he said. They rode out of the tree line and up to the cabin, and the door opened before they reached it, and Gerald Holt stepped out onto the porch. Howe was alone this time. The 2 men who'd come with him stayed on their horses, and he looked like a man who had made a decision about how far he was willing to take something and was discovering, in real time, that the terrain had changed under him without his noticing. He looked at Clara. He looked at the ledger under her arm. He looked at Elias. Something shifted in his face. "Mr. Holt," Clara said. Her voice was as even as the ground. "You've come a long way from Raven Creek." "Mrs. Whitmore," Holt said, "I think it's time we settled this matter." "It was settled in December," she said. "And again in your office 10 days later. And again when your man Marsh came up this mountain with a fraudulent writ." She reached into the ledger and produced the filed copy, the official document with the docket number and the court seal, and held it up so he could see it clearly. "And again yesterday afternoon, when this complaint was logged with the territorial court in Laramie." Holt went very still. "Docket number is on the front page if you'd like to verify it," she said. "Unlike the document Marsh brought, this one is real." The 2 men on the horses exchanged a look. "You filed with the territory," Holt said. His voice had changed. The pleasantness was entirely gone now, and what was underneath it was smaller than she'd expected. Not dangerous, just small. "I did," she said. "Every interaction you've had with me, every fraudulent claim, every threat, every man you've sent, it's all in there. Dated, signed, and on official record." She lowered the document. "If you make any further claim against me, you do so against that record. A real lawyer will tell you that is a position you cannot recover from." Holt looked at Elias. Elias said nothing. Howe was standing 3 feet to Clara's right, with his hands at his sides, and his rifle on his back, and his face entirely neutral, and the neutrality said everything it needed to. Holt looked back at Clara. "You think this is over," he said. "I know it is," she said. "Because you're a businessman, and you've just learned that the cost of continuing exceeds the value of what you're pursuing." She paused. "There's no version of this that ends well for you now. You know that." The two men on the horses shifted. One of them said quietly to Holt, "Sir." Holt heard it. He looked at the filed copy in Clara's hand one more time. Then he looked at her face, at the steadiness in it, at the complete absence of the fear he had banked on from the beginning, and he understood, in the particular way of men who have built their power on the vulnerability of others, that the vulnerability was gone. That what was standing in front of him was not the woman who had begged in the saloon and had not been for some time, and that he had made the mistake of not understanding that quickly enough. He stepped off the porch. He mounted his horse. He looked at her one last time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Goodbye, Mr. Holt," she said. He rode away. His men followed. Elias watched them go until the sound of the horses faded completely. Then he turned and looked at Clara, who was standing on the porch of his cabin with the filed copy in her hand and the ledger under her arm and her face absolutely composed. "You all right?" he asked. She took a breath. "Yes," she said. She looked at the copy in her hand. Then she opened the ledger and placed it carefully inside and closed the cover and held it against her chest for a moment with both arms. "It's done," she said. Not the same way she'd said it on the courthouse steps. Lighter than that, surer. "It's really done." He came up the porch steps and stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. The mountain was quiet around them. The cold was real and present and entirely familiar, and the cabin behind her was exactly as they'd left it. The chimney still smoking from a fire that had burned down to coals but not gone out. The door standing slightly open, the horses tied out front still restless from the road, and Clara Whitmore standing on his porch with her ledger and her filed complaint and her 2 months of mountain work and her 6-mile walk in the snow and everything she had built from nothing, looking at him with an expression that had no performance left in it at all. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, where the wind had pulled it loose. She went very still. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "You're not so bad yourself," she said softly. He almost laughed. Almost. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked past him into the cabin. He followed, and the door closed behind them against the mountain air, and the fire needed rebuilding, and there was work to be done. There was always work to be done. That was the one constant of this life. But for the first time in 11 years, Elias Carter went about the work of the evening with his whole chest full of something that he hadn't had a name for in a very long time. And Clara moved around the cabin's small space with the ease of someone who knew exactly where she was. Because she did. She was home. The fire that night burned longer than necessary. Neither of them talked about it, the extra log Elias put on before they ate, the way neither of them moved toward the curtain when supper was done, the way they stayed at the table past the point where there was anything practical left to discuss. The ledger was closed. The horses were stabled. The filed copy was safe between its protective papers. Everything that had needed doing was done, and yet neither of them moved. Clara had her hands around an empty coffee cup, turning it slowly in circles the way she did when she was thinking through something she hadn't finished with yet. Elias had his elbows on the table and was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man conducting an argument with himself that he was not winning. Finally, she said, "You're quiet." "I'm always quiet," he said. "You're quieter than usual." She set the cup down. "What is it?" He looked at her. He had said, at the fire on the trail, what needed to be said. "I want you to stay. You are the most real person I've ever known." And she had answered him clearly and without games, the way she did everything. And they had ridden back to the mountain with their hands clasped across the dark. And now Holt was gone, and the threat was filed away in a docket number in Laramie, and Clara had said, "I'm home," without quite saying it, with her whole body, by the way she'd walked through the door. And Elias Carter, who had spent 11 years getting very comfortable with what he was and was not, was sitting at his own table feeling something he could only describe as terrified. Not of Clara, of the size of what he stood to lose now. "I'm not good at this," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You said that already. At the fire." "I know." He turned his own cup in his hands. "I'm saying it again because I want you to understand that I mean it practically, not as a way of backing away from what I said." He paused. "I mean that I will make mistakes. I mean that there will be times I go inside myself and don't come back out fast enough, and you'll be sitting across from me wondering what happened to me." He looked at her directly. "I've spent 11 years answering only to myself and the mountain. That makes a man—" He stopped. "Particular," she offered. "I was going to say difficult." "Particular," she repeated. "It makes a man particular, which is different from difficult." She tilted her head slightly. "I am also particular, Elias. I track supply consumption by the day. I kept a legal record of every threat made against me for 7 months. I walked 6 miles up a mountain in a snowstorm to return a debt I chose to feel obligated by." She paused. "I am not looking for an easy man. I've had an easy man. Easy is not the same as good." He looked at her. "I'm not easy either," he said. "In case you'd missed that." "I haven't missed a thing," she said, and the way she said it, quiet, certain, with the weight of 2 months of close observation behind it, landed somewhere in the middle of his chest and stayed there. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, the same way he'd done at the fire, and she turned her hand over and held it the same way she'd done then. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat like that for a while, and the fire worked in the stove, and outside the mountain held its cold against the darkness, the way it always had and always would, entirely indifferent to the 2 people inside the cabin who had just, quietly and without ceremony, decided to stop being alone. March came in hard and then softened. The cold broke in the 3rd week, not all at once. Nothing on the mountain ever happened all at once, but incrementally, one slightly less frozen morning after another, the light lasting a few minutes longer each day, the air losing its edge by degrees. Until one morning, Elias stepped outside and felt something in the temperature that he recognized from 11 previous springs as the first true intimation that winter was nearly done. He stood on the porch with his coffee and breathed it in. The door opened behind him, and Clara came out, pulling her coat around herself, and stood beside him. She felt it too. He could tell by the way she went still for a moment, her face lifting slightly. "That's different," she said. "Spring," he said. "Still a few weeks out, but it's coming." She looked at the sky for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Elias," she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." He looked at her. "All right. Are you happy?" she said. Simply. Directly. The way she always said the things that mattered. He considered it the way she'd asked. Honestly, not carefully. "I don't know that I've thought about happy in a long time," he said. "The mountain asks for functional. Satisfied, maybe, when the season went well. Comfortable, some winters, when the work was good." He paused. "This is different from any of those things." "Different how?" He looked out at the mountain in the early light. "Those things are about the day going right," he said. "What I feel now is not about the day. It's there regardless of the day." He glanced at her. "It's there when I wake up before you do and hear you sleeping on the other side of the curtain. It's there when you argue with me about the trapline and you're right. It's there when I come in from the cold and you hand me coffee you made because you knew I'd be cold, not because you were asked." He paused. "I don't know if that's happy, but it's something I didn't have before, and I'm not interested in not having it anymore." Clara looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were bright. "That," she said, very quietly, "is happy." He looked at her, and then, for the first time since she'd arrived on his porch in the snow 4 months ago, Elias Carter smiled. A full, real, unhurried thing that reached all the way to his eyes and stayed there. Clara looked at it like she'd been waiting for it. "I want to write to my sister," she said after a moment. "Ellen, in Ohio. I want to tell her I'm all right." She paused. I haven't written since October. She'll be worried. We can get a letter out the next time someone from Raven Creek passes through heading south, he said. Davies goes to the postal office in the last week of every month. I know. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I want to tell her the truth. Not just that I'm all right. The truth. He looked at her. What does the truth look like? He said. She met his eyes. That I found something I didn't expect to find, she said. In a place I didn't expect to find it, and that I'm staying. He held her gaze for a moment. Tell her that then, he said. She nodded. A week later, Caleb Davies came through on his regular pass south, and Clara gave him 2 letters, one to her sister in Ohio, one to Patterson at the courthouse in Laramie with a note of thanks and a request to confirm the complaint remained on active record. Davies took them without curiosity and promised delivery, and Clara watched him ride south down the trail and then turned back to the cabin with the expression of a woman who had set the last remaining loose end in order. Done, she said. Done, he agreed. She looked at him with that slight half-smile that lived on the left side of her face. You're going to stop being surprised every time things resolve themselves, she said. I'm not surprised, he said. I'm relieved. That's just surprise in a longer coat, she said. He stared at her. She walked back into the cabin. He stood on the porch for a moment, and the thing in his chest that he'd been calling something else for weeks because naming it directly had felt like too much pressure on a thing that needed room to grow. That thing had a name, and he knew it, and he was done pretending otherwise. He went inside after her. She was already at the table with the morning accounts. Clara, he said. She looked up. I love you, he said, plainly. The way she'd taught him to say important things, by watching her do it. No preamble, no softening. Just the fact of it laid on the table like a legitimate document with all the right information in the right place. She went very still. Then she set down her pen. Elias Carter, she said. It took you long enough. I know. I've been waiting since February. I know that too. She stood up from the table and crossed the small space between them and took his face in both her hands, the way a woman does when she has decided something completely. And she looked at him for a moment, with everything she was entirely visible in her expression. The ledger keeper, and the mountain walker, and the woman who had stood down a fraudulent writ in her dead husband's name, and rebuilt herself from the foundations up. And she said, I love you too. I have for a while. I was giving you time. You could have said something, he said. I could have, she agreed. But you needed to find it yourself. You wouldn't have trusted it otherwise. He thought about that. She was right. She was almost always right, and he was mostly done being startled by it. He put his hands over hers where they held his face. What do you want? He said. Not for today, for what do you want? She looked at him steadily. I want to stay on this mountain, she said. I want to build something here that's both of ours. I want to expand the trap line in the fall, and I want to plant a kitchen garden in the spring, and I want to submit a complaint to the territorial legislature about the state of land protection law for widowed women in Wyoming Territory. Because what happened to me has happened to other women and should not be allowed to continue. She paused. And I want to sleep without that curtain between us. The last one landed with the quiet force of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. He looked at her. The curtain comes down today, he said. She smiled. The full one, wide and unguarded and entirely real. Good, she said. The curtain came down that afternoon. It was a practical operation. She unhooked it from the rope line while he was out checking the early spring signs on the trap line. And when he came back, it was folded neatly on the shelf, and the cabin felt twice as large without it, which was an illusion, but a persuasive one. She had also, he noticed, moved her small collection of things. The ledger books, the sewing kit, the 2 spare dresses folded on the shelf, to the main room without making a production of it. As if the cabin had always been organized this way. As if there had never been a partition. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the rearranged space. She looked at him from across the room. All right, she said. Better than all right, he said. She went back to the accounts. He hung up his coat and went to wash up, and the cabin held them both without partition or apology. And outside the mountain was starting, in its slow and utterly reliable way, to let go of winter. April arrived with mud and birdsong, and the particular aggressive optimism of the high country coming back to life after months of cold. The creek ran high and fast with snowmelt. The timber showed green at the tips of the branches. Clara planted her kitchen garden in the south-facing patch below the cabin. Onions, beans, squash, and a determined row of carrots that she tended with the same methodical attention she brought to the ledger. Crouching in the mud with her skirt pinned up and her hands in the dirt, talking to the plants in the same absent-minded way she talked to the horses. Elias watched her from the porch one morning and felt something so large and uncomplicated that it embarrassed him slightly. She looked up and caught him watching. "Come help," she said. "You're better at spacing than I am." "I don't know anything about gardening," he said. "You know about spacing things so they have room to grow," she said. "Same principle." He came off the porch. She handed him a fistful of bean seeds and showed him the row, and he worked beside her in the spring mud, and they didn't talk much, just worked, the way they always did their best thinking, side by side, hands occupied, the silence between them, the kind that was full rather than empty. "The sister wrote back," Clara said. He looked at her. "Ellen, a letter came with Davies last week. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you what she said." "What did she say?" Clara sat back on her heels and looked at the row of seeds. "She said she always knew Thomas wasn't right for me, that she'd prayed I'd find my footing after he passed, that she said she was glad I found someone worth staying for." She looked at him sideways. "She wants to meet you." He processed that. "Ohio is a long way," he said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "But she might come west. She's been thinking about it for a while. Her husband has family in Colorado Territory." She paused. "I told her what you look like." He looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said you were tall and dark-eyed and not very talkative but extremely competent." She went back to the seeds. "And that you made good coffee." "High praise," he said. "I thought so," she said, and she was smiling at the dirt and not looking at him, and he let it go, and they finished the row. That spring also brought something else, the news from Raven Creek. Davies carried it on his April run, stopping at the cabin with his usual load and an expression that said he'd been looking forward to delivering this particular piece of information. "Holt's gone," he said. He said it to Elias, but he was watching Clara. Clara looked up from the porch where she'd been mending. "Gone how?" she said. "Territorial Marshal came through in March," Davies said. "Turned out you weren't the first complaint against him, Mrs. Carter, ma'am." He caught himself on the name, glancing between them with a slight hesitation. Neither of them corrected him. Clara felt the name settle over her like something that had been waiting in the mail. "There were others?" she said. "3 other women in 2 counties," Davies said. "Same scheme, near enough. Loans, inflated interest, fraudulent claims, manufactured pressure. Your filing in Laramie was the 4th, and the one that had the most documentation, apparently. The marshal used it as the foundation." He shifted his weight. "Holt's business is shuttered. He's facing charges in Cheyenne. His lawyer, a real one, told him it was a losing case, and he should make arrangements." Davies shook his head. "The man's done." Clara sat very still. Elias watched her face. It was not the expression of triumph. He'd expected triumph. He thought she deserved it and would have understood it entirely. But what was on her face was something quieter than that. Something that looked more like the closing of a long account that had been open too long. The satisfaction not of winning, but of being done. "Thank you, Caleb," she said. "I'm glad to know it." "Thought you would be," Davies said. He tipped his hat and went to water his horse. Clara looked out at the middle distance for a moment. Then she looked at Elias. "3 other women," she said. "Yes. 3 other women who didn't have anyone paying attention to the docket numbers." She said it evenly, without anger, but with something underneath it. "You paid attention," he said. "I paid attention because I had to," she said. "Because no one else was going to." She was quiet for a moment. That's the thing I keep coming back to. How many women are in positions like mine were, like those three others were, and don't have the records or the knowledge or the... She stopped. The ground to stand on? He said. She looked at him. Yes, she said. Exactly that. He looked at her. At the expression on her face, which he recognized as the look she got when she was not just thinking about something, but beginning to plan around it. The legislative complaint you mentioned, he said. In the spring, when you said what you wanted. Yes, she said. Are you serious about it? She met his eyes. Completely, she said. I have the documentation. I have the case. I have the territorial filing as the basis. She paused. I'll need help writing it in the right language. I'll need to understand how petitions reach the legislature. I'll need... Patterson, he said. She blinked. Patterson at the courthouse. He'll know the procedure. He's seen enough filings to know what works and what doesn't. He paused. And I know a man in Cheyenne. Used to trap with him, years ago, before he went into law. His name is Alderman. He's not a famous man, but he's an honest one, and he knows how the territorial legislature operates. Clara stared at him. You know a lawyer in Cheyenne, she said. I know a man who became a lawyer, he said. Different thing, but useful. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was too full to be described simply. Elias Carter, she said. You continue to surprise me. Don't get used to it, he said. She laughed. The real kind, full and bright, with no delay at all. The letter to Alderman went out with Davies in May, and the reply came in June, and by midsummer, Clara had a 40-page petition drafted in the careful, precise language that mixed her own accounting mind with Alderman's procedural knowledge, and it sat on the table in the cabin every evening like a living thing, getting longer and more specific and more irrefutable by the week. Elias read every draft. Howe was not a man who commented much on work in progress. He'd learned from her that some things needed to be done without the ongoing opinion of bystanders. But when she asked, which she did on the evenings when she read sections aloud to test their clarity, he answered with the directness she'd come to expect and value. This section loses the thread. Go back to the January entry. This argument needs the Marsh incident. The livery detail is what makes it concrete. This language is too formal. Patterson said the legislature responds to plain speaking, and you know plain speaking better than anyone I've ever met. She incorporated every note. She also, in those same summer evenings, began teaching him her accounting method. It started because he asked, on a June night when she was balancing the season's trapping accounts, whether the way she structured her columns was something she'd developed herself or learned from her father. Both, she said. My father's system was the foundation. I modified it. She turned the ledger toward him. It's not complicated. The principle is just, everything gets recorded, immediately, before the memory has time to adjust the facts. And every entry has a date. She looked at him. Would you like to understand it properly? Yes, he said. She taught him over the course of 3 weeks, in the evenings after supper, and he was a quick student because the underlying logic of it. Record everything, date everything, let the numbers tell the truth without interpretation, aligned with how he already thought about the world. By the end of July, he was keeping his own trapline records in her format, and she reviewed them without comment, except on the one occasion when he'd transposed 2 figures, which she caught in under 30 seconds and pointed out without making anything of it. Impressive, he said. Simple arithmetic, she said. No, he said. I meant you. She looked up from the ledger. Howe was looking at her with the steady, direct regard that she had understood, by now, was the way Elias Carter looked at the things he valued most. The trapline in good season, the mountain in clear weather, the particular balance of a well-kept account. She looked back at the ledger, but she was smiling. August brought the petition to Alderman's desk for final review, and his response came back with one amendment, a minor restructuring of the 3rd section, and the words, "This is one of the strongest petitions I have read in 20 years of practice. Submit it." Clara read the letter 3 times. Then she handed it to Elias. He read it. He set it on the table. Submit it, he said. That's what he says, she said. That's what I say too. She looked at him. You think it's enough? "I think you've been building that document for 6 months with the same care you brought to the ledger," he said. And the ledger ended Holt. He held her gaze. "It's enough." She looked at the letter. Then she looked at the petition. Then she picked up her pen. The petition went to the territorial legislature in September, hand-delivered by Alderman, who had agreed to present it himself on the grounds that it deserved proper advocacy. Clara wrote him a letter of authorization and a detailed brief of supporting materials, and she sent both with a third document, a personal letter to the committee chair, signed in her own name, in her own plain-spoken voice, that laid out what had happened to her and what she believed should follow from it. 2 weeks later, a letter came back. It was not a ruling. It was not a law. It was an acknowledgement of receipt and a notification that the petition had been referred to the Committee on Property and Civil Affairs for consideration in the autumn session. Clara read it at the table with Elias sitting across from her. When she finished, she set it down. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. "It's not done," she said. "It'll take more sessions, more letters, more pressure. It might take years." "I know," he said. "I'm prepared for that," she said. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You understand what you've signed on for. A woman with a petition and a lawyer and a legislative process that is going to require her attention and her correspondence and her time for—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. "I know who you are," he said. "I knew who you were in February when you called out a fraudulent writ in front of 3 armed men without a tremor in your voice. I knew who you were in March when you came down off a mountain to face the man who'd spent 7 months trying to ruin you. I knew who you were in April when you heard there were 3 other women, and your first thought wasn't relief that it was over. It was that it shouldn't happen to anyone else." He looked at her directly. "I am not surprised by any of this. I'm glad of it. There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are a remarkable man," she said. "I'm a particular man," he said. "You told me so." She laughed. The mountain kept its own time through that autumn and into the next winter, which came harder and faster than the one before it. The season always made its own terms and cared nothing for human arrangements. And the cabin was fuller now in every sense, warmer for the drafts she'd sealed, and louder for the presence of 2 people who talked every evening and argued about trap lines and read to each other by firelight, and conducted the specific, ordinary, daily business of 2 people who have decided to build something together and are finding, to their mutual surprise, that it is built better than either of them expected. Elias ran the trap line. Clara ran the accounts. They argued about the East Corridor every season, and she was right about it more often than not, which he had long since stopped finding surprising and had come to find, instead, a reliable source of satisfaction. Not because he liked being wrong, but because the fact that she was usually right meant the decisions they made together were better than the ones he'd made alone. The legislative petition moved through its process. The second session brought a subcommittee review. The third brought an amendment hearing. By the time the Wyoming Territorial Legislature passed the Married and Widowed Women's Property Protection Act in the spring of 1884, 3 years after a woman had walked 6 miles up a mountain in a snowstorm to return a debt she hadn't owed, the act contained language drawn directly from Clara Whitmore Carter's original petition, and the committee chair cited her documentation as the foundational case in his floor remarks. Alderman wrote with the news. Clara read the letter at the table on a Tuesday morning in April, with the spring air coming through the open door and the sound of Elias outside with the horses. And she read it twice, and then she sat very still for a moment with the letter in her hands. Then she stood up and went to the door. "Elias," she said. He looked up from the stable. She held up the letter. He came. He read it on the porch beside her, standing close enough that their shoulders touched, his eyes moving through Alderman's words with the focused speed she'd watched him develop over 3 years of reading everything she put in front of him. When he finished, he looked up. She was watching his face. "It passed," he said. "It passed," she said. He looked at the letter again. "They used your language," he said. "They used my language," she said. He looked at her. At the woman who had arrived on his porch in the snow, with nothing but a canvas bag and an absolute refusal to be anything other than what she was. At the woman who had rebuilt herself in his cabin, on his mountain, with his coffee and his terrible supply inventory, and his 11 years of accumulated solitude. Rebuilt herself not into something new, but into the fullest possible version of what she had always been. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. They stood on the porch of the cabin that had been his for 11 winters and was now entirely and completely theirs. And the mountains spread out before them the way it always had. Indifferent, vast, permanent. And below them, somewhere in the valley, the world was a small degree fairer than it had been the week before, because a woman had kept good records and refused to be afraid. "You know what this means," Clara said. "Tell me," he said. "There will be other petitions," she said. "Other women who need someone to show them what documentation can do. Other cases that need the right language." She paused. "I'm going to be busy." "I know," he said. "You'll be doing more of the supply accounts yourself," she said. "I've been doing them for a year already," he said. "I don't transpose figures anymore." "You transposed one last March." "One." It was significant. It was $2. She looked up at him with the half-smile on the left side of her face. "I love you," she said, simply. The way she said it every time, not saving it for special occasions, not depleting it by overuse, just placing it in the conversation where it belonged, the way she placed every important thing, accurately and with full intention. "I love you," he said. The mountain held them in its vast and permanent silence. And in Raven Creek, people still told the story of the mountain man who had paid a stranger's debt one winter evening. How he'd laid down everything he had for a woman he'd never spoken to. How she'd shown up at his cabin the next morning with nothing but her refusal to be saved. They told it as a story about him. But the women who heard it, the ones who were keeping their own ledgers, documenting their own threats, holding their own evidence against the day they'd need it, they knew the truth of it. It was her story. It had always been hers. She had simply needed one morning, one man, and one moment of solid ground under her feet to stand up and tell it herself. And she never stopped.